I nearly choked on my morning coffee when I opened the envelope from the HOA. It felt heavier than usual in my hands, a foreboding weight that sent a chill down my spine. I had lived in Oakwood Estates for 5 years, keeping to myself, tending to my prize-winning roses, and paying my dues like everyone else. But as I pulled out the thick notice and read the bolded words at the top, my stomach dropped. My monthly HOA fees were tripling to $320, effective in just 30 days. My hands trembled as I reread the letter, my coffee forgotten, cooling on the kitchen counter. Through my front window, I spotted Karen Thompson, our smug HOA board president, strutting down the sidewalk in her designer workout gear, phone in hand, inspecting lawns with her usual look of disapproval. Her sharp eyes landed on my property, and she paused, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her screen as she took a picture of my rose garden, shaking her head in feigned disgust. Just last week, she had left a warning notice on my door, claiming my roses were unsightly and lowering property values. These were the same roses that had won the county gardening competition 3 years running. My blood simmered, but I forced myself to breathe. I hadn't told anyone yet, but an email I received yesterday confirmed my new position as the HOA's external auditor. Karen and her board had no idea, but they had just given the wrong person a reason to start digging. The screech of tires yanked me out of my spiraling thoughts. I turned my head just in time to see Sarah Mitchell, Karen's right-hand enforcer on the board, standing by the curb, pointing at a tow truck as it latched onto a battered pickup. That was Mr. Rodriguez's grandson's truck. He had been helping install a wheelchair ramp for his grandfather, but apparently a work truck was an eyesore in the neighborhood, according to Sarah's loud, self-righteous phone conversation outside my window. Mr. Rodriguez, a 78-year-old widower, had already been struggling to get around after his last surgery. His grandson had taken time off work to build the ramp himself since hiring a contractor was too expensive. But none of that mattered to Karen or Sarah. They didn't care that this was about basic accessibility. They only cared about keeping up their version of the neighborhood's aesthetic. I clenched my jaw as I tucked the fee increase notice into my office folder, right beside my certified auditor credentials and the last 6 months of suspicious HOA financial statements I had been quietly collecting. Things hadn't been adding up for a while. New landscaping fees appeared every month despite the community garden dying from neglect. Mysterious maintenance charges were billed for non-existent repairs. And now, this massive fee hike with no clear explanation beyond vague property improvements. Later that morning, as I walked to my mailbox, I overheard Karen chatting with another board member, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Oh, the Tesla." "Yes, well, it was time for an upgrade," she giggled, tossing her hair. "And I'm redoing my entire kitchen next month. Custom cabinets, marble countertops, the works." My stomach twisted as I processed her words. Karen had lost her job at the real estate agency last month. I knew that because financial auditing gave me a knack for knowing things. A job loss, yet she was suddenly swimming in luxury purchases? Where was the money coming from? I already had my suspicions, but now I was certain. She was using HOA funds as her personal piggy bank. Just then, Lisa, my neighbor, hurried over, looking pale and panicked. She shoved her own HOA notice at me, her hands shaking. "They're threatening to put a lien on my house if I don't pay the increase," she whispered, glancing around like she was afraid Karen had spies. "I'm a single mom. I can't afford this." Her voice cracked, and I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. That's when Karen's brand-new Tesla purred to a stop beside us. "Ladies," she called sweetly, lowering her tinted window. "I hope you're discussing the exciting new changes coming to our community." Her eyes flickered toward my roses, and her smile sharpened. "Oh, and don't forget, our new security system is being installed next week. The cameras will help us better monitor property violations." I knew exactly what she meant. I had already seen the $50,000 invoice buried in last month's HOA records, an absurdly overpriced contract awarded to her brother's company. The same brother whose landscaping company had mysteriously won every HOA contract for the past 3 years without a single competitive bid. When I got back inside, I pulled out my laptop and opened my work email. There it was. Official confirmation of my role as the HOA's external auditor. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I typed my acceptance reply. Karen had no idea that her perfect little kingdom was about to face its first real audit in 5 years. I barely had time to savor the moment before a knock at my door made me jump. I opened it to find Mr. Rodriguez, leaning heavily on his cane, holding a crumpled violation notice in his weathered hands. "They're making me tear out the ramp," he said, his voice trembling. "They say it doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." His grandson had already been banned from the neighborhood for parking violations, leaving him to struggle on his own. I looked past him toward Karen's house, where a team of workers was installing a massive, unapproved fountain in her front yard. Beyond that, I could see Sarah measuring my rose bushes with a ruler, violation notebook in hand. My jaw tightened. Time to start taking my own pictures. I helped Mr. Rodriguez to a chair on my porch and pulled out my voice recorder. "Would you mind telling me more about these violations?" I asked. I needed every detail. And as I spoke, I watched Karen's fountain workers accidentally crack her driveway with their truck. Funny how that violation would never make it into the HOA records. I just needed to stay quiet for 7 more days. 1 week until my first official audit meeting, where I would have access to every financial record, every board decision, every violation notice from the past 5 years. Karen and her little empire of corruption had no idea they had a ticking time bomb right in their midst. I had already compiled months of evidence, but the more I dug, the worse it got. Fake repair invoices. Payments for services never rendered. Fees funneled into personal expenses disguised as community improvements. And now, retaliatory violations against anyone who dared question the insane fee increases. The only question left was how many more neighbors would they crush before I could take them all down. My hands were sweating as I walked into the HOA office for my first day as their auditor. Karen's fake smile dropped when I asked to see 5 years of financial records. "Oh, those old things," she laughed, twirling her designer handbag. "They're probably in storage somewhere." I knew right then she was hiding something big. I spent that week digging through dusty boxes in the basement, pulling receipts, scanning payments, matching records. And then I saw it. Every single landscaping bill was from Thompson Brothers LLC. A quick Google search confirmed what I already knew. Karen's brother owned the company. And they were charging us triple the normal rate for basic lawn work. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. At first, I thought Karen and her board were just greedy, overcharging the HOA for personal gain. But then I stumbled onto something bigger. A series of wire transfers caught my attention. Tens of thousands of dollars moving between the HOA's account and a company called Bright Horizon Consulting. That name wasn't familiar, so I ran a background check. No website. No physical office. Just a P.O. box in another state and a vague description of community management services. But here's where it got interesting. Karen's husband had recently started a consulting business. And guess what its registered name was? Bright Horizon Consulting, LLC. My hands gripped the printed records so hard my knuckles turned white. Karen wasn't just mismanaging funds. She was straight up embezzling money through a fake business. My pulse pounded as I connected the dots. The consulting fees matched the exact amount of the HOA fee increases over the past year. She had been taking money directly from the homeowners and funneling it into her family's account. This wasn't just fraud, this was criminal. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the proof. Karen had spent years ruling over this neighborhood like a queen, punishing people over flower colors and trash can placement. But now, I had the power to burn her little kingdom to the ground. I needed a strategy. If I went straight to the board, they'd bury this. Karen had hand-picked them all, puppets who nodded along to her every word. But if I took this to the state auditor or law enforcement, I needed airtight evidence. Months of financial reports, recorded statements, and, if possible, a direct admission. That last part would be tricky. Karen wasn't stupid, she knew how to cover her tracks. But she had one fatal flaw, her arrogance. She thought she was untouchable. I just needed to make her feel comfortable enough to slip up. That's when I got an idea. I pulled up my email and drafted a message to Karen. As the new external auditor, I'd love to schedule a meeting to discuss financial efficiency within the HOA. I noticed some interesting trends in the recent reports and wanted to ensure that all allocations are fully compliant with HOA bylaws. I read it over twice. It was deliberately vague. Enough to make her nervous, but not enough to make her outright refuse. I hit send. "Within 10 minutes," she replied. "Of course. Looking forward to it." The smiley face at the end of her email was almost comical. I could practically hear her fake, bubbly voice. She had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, I walked into Karen's house with a hidden recorder in my pocket. Her place was practically dripping in stolen money. A brand-new marble kitchen. A massive chandelier. Custom furniture that probably cost more than my car. "Welcome," Karen beamed, leading me to her fancy dining table, where she had already set up an expensive charcuterie board. "I just love to invest in the community," she chirped, pouring herself a glass of imported wine. I almost laughed. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," I said, pulling out my folder. "I've been reviewing some of the vendor contracts and noticed that all landscaping work goes through Thompson Brothers, LLC. Her smile froze. "Oh, well, we just love to support local businesses, you know." I nodded, flipping to the next page. "And then there's Bright Horizon Consulting. The invoices are a bit unclear. Could you clarify exactly what services they provide?" I watched her carefully. Her grip tightened around her wine glass. "Oh, just general advisory work. Budget planning. Things like that." "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice light. "Because when I checked the state business registry, I noticed that Bright Horizon Consulting is owned by your husband." Karen stopped breathing for half a second. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but I caught it. Then, just as quickly, she laughed. "Oh, I see what's happening. You're new, and some of the older records can be confusing. I assure you, everything is perfectly legal." There it was. She had just confirmed her direct knowledge of the payments. And my recorder caught every word. That night, I uploaded everything to a secure drive. I was sitting on a mountain of evidence, but I needed to act fast. Karen had connections. If she got even a whiff that I was building a case, she'd shred documents, manipulate records, maybe even threaten people. I needed a public spectacle. Something she couldn't sweep under the rug. So I did something bold. I emailed every homeowner in Oakwood Estates. I kept it simple. "As your new HOA auditor, I want to ensure full transparency in financial matters. Please join us for an emergency HOA meeting this Friday, where I will present my findings on how our dues are being spent." I didn't mention Karen by name, but the implication was clear. Within an hour, my inbox exploded. Dozens of homeowners, furious about the fee hikes, demanding answers. A few even threatened legal action. That was when I got the text. "Unknown number, you need to stop digging." My stomach clenched. I stared at the message, my pulse pounding. Then another one came. "This isn't a game. Walk away." My blood turned to ice. Karen knew. Somehow, she knew I was on to her. And now, she was trying to scare me off. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. I locked my doors and stayed up until 3 a.m., compiling my final report. Bank records. Contract invoices. Illegally approved payments. Every violation Karen and her cronies had covered up. I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to bury her. By Friday night, over 200 homeowners packed into the HOA meeting hall. Karen took the stage, her fake smile firmly in place. "I know there's been a lot of confusion about the recent fee adjustments," she started, her voice sugary sweet. "But I want to assure you, everything we do is in the best interest of the community." She barely finished before a woman in the front row stood up. "Then why is there a lien on my house?" she demanded. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile tightened. "We have rules and—" I stood. "Then maybe you can explain these," I said, flipping on the projector. Spreadsheets filled the screen. Payments to Bright Horizon Consulting. HOA checks signed by Karen herself. Tens of thousands of missing dollars. Gasps filled the room. Karen's face went pale. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. I clicked to the next slide. An audio recording started playing, her voice, crystal clear. "I assure you, everything is perfectly legal." Silence. Dead. Heavy silence. And then, chaos. Homeowners shouting. A man in the back calling for a vote to remove the entire board. And Karen. She was already reaching for her phone, probably dialing her lawyer. But it was too late. I had already sent everything to the state authorities. Karen Thompson had ruled this neighborhood for years. But tonight, her reign was officially over. I stepped outside that morning, my routine unchanged, but something felt off before I even glanced at my driveway. The neighborhood had that eerie early morning stillness, where the air was cool but heavy, as if it carried the weight of something unspoken. Birds chirped lazily from the trees, and a distant lawn sprinkler whirred to life, but the usual sights of my home, the ones I'd come to expect after 3 years, had subtly, unsettlingly shifted. My car was gone. At first, my mind scrambled for logical explanations. Had I parked somewhere else? Loaned it to someone? But the creeping chill of reality set in the moment I saw the fresh yellow paint streaked across the curb in front of my house. It wasn't there yesterday. The thick lines were sloppily done, uneven, as though someone had rushed through the job. The paint still glistened in the early sunlight, damp and fresh, reeking of chemicals. That's when I noticed the fake violation notice slapped onto my front door. Cheap paper, hastily printed, completely unofficial. My heart pounded as I turned to check my security cameras, and what I saw made my blood boil. The footage played back in grainy black and white, time-stamped at 3 a.m. 2 figures moved stealthily under the dim glow of the streetlights, their silhouettes unmistakable. Karen and Sarah. It was almost comical, the way they sneaked around like teenagers pulling a prank, their exaggerated carefulness making them look more guilty than cautious. Sarah stood at the edge of my property, looking left and right as if she were starring in some low-budget heist movie, while Karen, dressed in her usual athleisure, knelt by the curb with a can of yellow paint. The footage showed her shaking the can violently before spraying haphazard lines onto the pavement, pausing only to check if the color was dark enough to mimic an official no-parking zone. They moved quickly, laughing in hushed voices, before Karen dramatically slapped the fake violation notice onto my front door like she was branding my home with a mark of shame. Then, at exactly 4:12 a.m., a tow truck rumbled into view, and my stomach clenched as I recognized the driver. Tony, Karen's friend from Quick Tow. The grainy footage showed Karen and Sarah ducking into Karen's white Tesla, parked across the street, watching the whole operation unfold. My car was hitched up and hauled away like it was never mine to begin with, disappearing into the night while the 2 women sat smugly in their luxury vehicle, basking in their manufactured victory. I exhaled sharply, forcing my pulse to steady as I stepped back inside and did what my lawyer always told me: document everything. My phone's camera clicked repeatedly as I snapped pictures of the wet paint, the empty space where my car had been, the close-up boot prints in my morning-damp grass. I moved methodically, knowing I needed irrefutable proof before confronting anyone. The neighborhood remained silent, oblivious, except for Mr. Rodriguez, who wheeled over from his front porch, his sharp eyes locked onto mine. He didn't need to ask. I could see in his face that he already knew something was wrong. Without a word, he held up his phone, his gnarled fingers gripping the device tightly. "Look what else they did last night," he whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of injustice. I leaned in, watching the shaky video he'd recorded through his window. It showed Karen and Sarah going door to door, slipping violation notices under the doors of every homeowner who had spoken up at the last HOA meeting. And then, as if that weren't enough, the footage captured them knocking over Mrs. Patterson's mailbox. My stomach twisted. Mrs. Patterson, the retired judge, had been the one asking tough questions about the HOA's missing funds. The situation was worse than I'd thought. They weren't just coming after me. They were coming after anyone who had dared to stand in their way. My jaw clenched as I replayed Mr. Rodriguez's video, my anger simmering into something sharper, something colder. I immediately called the police, but my frustration only grew when I realized Karen had already beaten me to it. She'd filed a bogus complaint about unauthorized vehicles in the neighborhood, playing the role of the responsible citizen before I could report the real crime. When the officer arrived, his demeanor was indifferent, his notepad half-heartedly open. I could see it in his face. He thought this was just another petty neighborhood dispute. That changed the moment I pulled out my auditor badge and showed him the security footage. His eyes widened, his pen finally moving with purpose as he began taking real notes. By then, more neighbors were stepping outside, drawn by the commotion. The Johnsons gasped when they discovered their award-winning garden had been trampled. The Patel kids burst into tears upon seeing their basketball hoop, one that had been legally approved, ripped from its cement base and discarded like trash. One by one, the pattern became undeniable. Every single person who had questioned the board's decisions had been hit with some form of retaliation. As the morning unfolded, my phone buzzed incessantly with messages from fellow homeowners. Word was spreading fast. Sarah, ever the loyal accomplice, was going door to door again, this time with a new lie. She was telling everyone that I was under investigation for stealing HOA funds. She waved around what looked like official documents, but even from a distance, I could tell they were fakes. No letterhead, no signatures, just an elaborate smokescreen to cover their own crimes. The absurdity of it all made me laugh, but my amusement was short-lived. The lies were escalating, but so was our evidence pile. By noon, I had created a shared online folder where neighbors could upload their photos, videos, and stories. I wasn't the only one fed up. People who had once stayed quiet were now coming forward, realizing that if we didn't fight back, we'd all be next. Even teenage Billy, the tech-savvy kid from down the street, joined in, offering up drone footage of Karen's brother's landscaping company. Footage that showed his crew dumping waste into our community garden at night. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted was damning. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. Karen and Sarah must have realized that their usual tactics weren't working because, instead of their usual smug confidence, they were now scrambling. Karen had holed herself up in her house, blinds drawn, while Sarah skulked around, knocking on doors, trying to clarify the situation. But people weren't buying it anymore. Mrs. Patterson, still fuming about her vandalized mailbox, had already called her lawyer. Mr. Rodriguez was on the phone with the local news, his voice sharp with determination.
And me?
I was standing in my front yard, watching as a tow truck, the same one that had taken my car, rolled up again. But this time, it wasn't here for me. It was here for Karen's Tesla. Tony, the tow truck driver who had so eagerly hauled my car away the night before, stepped out looking far less enthusiastic this time. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. Instead, he muttered something into his radio and started hooking Karen's car up to the rig. It didn't take long for Karen to realize what was happening. Her front door flew open so violently that it slammed against the exterior wall, and she came storming down the driveway, her perfectly styled blonde bob swaying with each furious step. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice high-pitched and sharp enough to make a few neighbors wince. Tony didn't even look up. "Illegal parking," he grunted, securing the last strap around her front tires. "HOA rules." The irony was almost too much to bear. "You can't tow my car. I'm on the HOA board." Karen was practically vibrating with rage, her hands balled into fists. But Tony just shrugged, clearly tired of the whole charade. "Rules are rules," he said flatly, repeating the same dismissive tone that I'd been given when I tried to protest my own car's removal. The hypocrisy of it all was delicious. The crowd that had gathered, neighbors who had once feared Karen's retaliation, began to murmur. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were outright laughing. Karen turned to them, her expression twisting into something desperate. "You're all making a mistake. I've done nothing but try to protect this community." The words might have worked a few months ago, but not now. Now they were met with cold stares and crossed arms. Then, as if things couldn't get worse for her, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The HOA's official auditor stepped out, a no-nonsense woman in a navy blue blazer, holding a thick file folder under one arm. She didn't waste any time. "Karen Thompson," she called, flipping open the folder. "We need to talk." Karen's face drained of color. Sarah, who had been lingering near the edge of the crowd, took one look at the situation and did what she did best, vanished. She all but sprinted back to her house, leaving Karen to face the music alone. The auditor walked up the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. "We've received multiple reports of financial discrepancies involving HOA funds. Given the severity of the allegations, you are hereby suspended from your position pending a full investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen staggered back, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is a misunderstanding," she whispered, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. I watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. Justice wasn't instant, and it wasn't always easy, but today it was tangible. As Karen's car was hauled away and the auditor continued her line of questioning, I finally allowed myself to breathe. This wasn't over, not yet. There would be hearings, legal battles, and no doubt more underhanded tactics from Karen and Sarah. But for the first time in a long time, the tide had turned. The neighborhood had woken up. And as I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, people who had once been too afraid to speak, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever.